Once you begin a project like this then, Amelia, what is the relationship with you and the director? Do you touch base on a regular basis, or are you left to your own devices for a lot of time and then catch up, say, every week, every 2 weeks? How does that relationship carry on once you're on the road, as it were, in terms of working and composing the score?
Yeah, I think with Emma, we probably spoke more than once a week, but we definitely had a day a week where she would get a bunch of cues basically from me, and then she would kind of respond to them, and then we'd have a talk, and then I'd kind of crack on and do notes and then crack on with the next load of cues. And I'd say that happened at a kind of weekly cycle. But then within that, obviously, there were lots of other conversations and emails and voice notes and, ideas and, while I'm thinking of it, could you just do this? Or I've just had an idea about this, or, so that it was an ongoing thing. And we stayed in touch, while she was, throughout the edit. And so yeah, we were in kind of contact for, the majority of the time. And then, yeah, obviously, as it got closer and closer to recording and to finishing, we were, speaking every day.
If you think of the original idea or the original ideas you had, Amelia, how does the finished soundtrack compare to that? Is it what you envisaged right at the start, or has the musical score gone on a bit of a journey during the composition process?
I think, in essence, it's what I imagined, but when I first have ideas for a score, it's almost like little fragments or little pieces that kind of come through. And I suppose that one of the main parts of the score didn't really come together until I saw the performances, and particularly Julia Thistlethwaite. And once I saw her and how funny 𝗟𝗚𝗚𝗏 is and how brilliant she is and her timing and her kind of physicality and her tics, that really informed the comedy, So then once I'd seen her performance, that's where all the kind of the woodwind came from, and the short kind of, the little fun percussive woodwind came from that. So, and then once that was working, then that became a really big thread of the score, and once that's kind of took off on its own little journey, all the clarinet and the bassoon and the oboe stuff was really kind of about Julia. So that I wasn't necessarily expecting that to be the direction, but that's kind of what ended up working to the picture.
You mentioned a few instruments there, Amelia. Can you give us a sense of scale in terms of the number of musicians, number of instruments then, just to give us a sense of how big, how small? Was it in between, the size of the musicians used for this score?
I think it was kind of in between. We had a big string section, which was really, really nice. And then we did lots of kind of soloists individually. So for all the woodwind, because it was so precise and because the timing and because it was very expressive, it didn't really work having lots of musicians playing at the same time. So it was much more about catching musical moments and these kind of solo performances. So for the woodwind particularly, we had a little woodwind kind of section, but mainly it was all these amazing soloists for those bits. And then for the more sweeping kind of big scale stuff, it was a really, beautiful string section.
You mentioned about strings. What is it about the strings that lends itself so well to a score like this? The strings come across as a very dependable group of instruments that a lot of composers go to for that sort of bulky sound.
Yeah, I think that, it's just a sound like no other. You can't recreate it in any other way. And there's something about strings in a big group that is just so heart-stoppingly beautiful. And I think that to create kind of a sweep and a scope, there's nothing really that can do it in the same way, to create that space and that grandness. But then also they can be incredibly intimate and beautiful, and they're just so versatile. And I think there's just the collective playing of people together that's just kind of unbeatable.
As a composer, how does it feel when you come to the recording process, Amelia? Because I guess the majority of your work is done and dusted Do you feel a sense of trepidation, nervousness when the music gets recorded and put to bed, as it were?
I feel it's more anticipation more than nerves, because I feel like you say most of the hard work usually at that stage is done, you know, and it's kind of too late to change anything, which is quite liberating, really. So it's not like you can be there on the day making big changes. Like, you really have to just accept what you've got. And what's great is that it normally always sounds better when musicians play it. Always sounds better than the samples that you've got used to hearing, you know, the pretend flute or the pretend clarinet. When you actually hear someone playing a clarinet, you know, it just can never underestimate just how much better it sounds. So usually what you have is just elevated on that day or those days. So it's a really exciting day usually. And then, you know, there's always time restraints and it's always a push to get it done. But I'm always so excited on recording days. In
terms of the score, Amelia, are there plans for a soundtrack release, like a physical version? Are you aware if that will happen?
Yeah, I think they are. I think Lakeshore are releasing it. I can't remember the date. I think it might be the 26th, actually. I think that Lakeshore are releasing the soundtrack, which is great.
Can you give some insight into putting a score release together? Because obviously the music is part of the film. That's the original idea. But the score release is slightly different, isn't it? Because it kind of stands on its own 2 feet and the music is front and centre. It's a different genre, isn't it?
Yeah, I suppose so. I definitely changed the order, particularly on this one. I don't know if I have done on all of them, but for this one I did, just because of the film. You know, the comedy is very much the kind of front half of the film, and then it gets more serious. So the soundtrack would have just been kind of comedy cue, comedy cue, comedy cue. So I wanted to try and have more of a mix and more of a build or mix between the smaller cues and the bigger, more orchestral cues. And so I kind of played around with the running order quite a lot. There's some cues that, you know, didn't end up on the soundtrack just because they don't really necessarily work on their own, or they just kind of work for a moment in the film. So, you know, it's also just slightly stripping it back a bit and just trying to have things that are either really important moments in the film, because I think, you know, I hate that when you find a soundtrack and something, you know, really memorable isn't there, but mainly just the pieces that work on their own musically.
So could you argue that the soundtrack release will be a different sort of score compared to the film, because you've kind of changed things around compared to the film? Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah, I mean, I suppose that it's a slightly different experience listening to it as a kind of album, I suppose.
And as a composer, how pleasing is it to get a standalone soundtrack release? You know, is that kind of a bit of a holy grail for composers? Because not all soundtracks get a release on their own 2 feet, shall we say?
Yeah, I think it's always just such a bonus, and you always feel very grateful and lucky when the music's actually getting a chance to kind of exist on its own. It's something I'm always really grateful for, and yeah, it's obviously preferable, I think, to be able to have it out there. So no, I'm really thrilled.
Amelia, thank you for your time. Great to catch up once again, and all the best with the score, and good luck with your future projects. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Well, it was fantastic to catch up with Amelia for another interview. Great to ask him questions about the brand new score to the film, Mr. Malcolm's List. A reminder that the score is available to buy and to download from Lakeshore Records. And let's finish the show with another track from her score. This is track 18, The Chase. So for the time being, it's a very good afternoon. Pranam da. See you at the same time, same place next Sunday afternoon for another edition of The Film Show. Take care for now.